The sky above the dying Reich was a map of chaos, and First Lieutenant Merritt Dwayne Francies was its most vulnerable cartographer. Crammed into the flimsy cockpit of his Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a fabric-skinned aircraft laughably designated Observation Liaison, he flew a solitary patrol ahead of the roaring spearhead of the 5th Armored Division. This was April 11, 1945, and the Elbe River was a breath away. Berlin, less than 50 miles to the east, a fever dream within grasp. But from this perch at 700 feet, the Victory March looked different. A ragged tapestry of burning villages, fleeing refugees, and stubborn pockets of resistance igniting without warning. Francis's world was the shudder of wind in the wing braces, the gasoline smell of the 65-horsepower engine, and the vast, exposed silence. His eyes, sharpened by a year of war, scanned not for glory, but for the fleeting shadow, the anomalous dust trail, the single German courier on a motorcycle who might reveal a hidden strongpoint. He and his observer, Lieutenant William Bill Martin, were the division's naked eyes, unarmed, unarmored, and utterly essential. Every tank column surging below relied on their warnings. Every hidden 88mm gun they missed could write a battalion's obituary. On this afternoon, their vigilance fixed on a solitary figure on a BMW motorcycle weaving through a country lane like a nervous messenger of doom. Tracking him was the mission. But as Francies banked the Grasshopper, the brittle sunlight glinted not on chrome below, but on perspex above. His blood turned to ice. There, slightly higher and on a converging course, cruised the angular, gangly silhouette of a German Fieseler 156 Storch, the enemy's own legendary observation plane. Its high wings and slow, uncanny agility mirrored his own Grasshopper's purpose, but its mission was a dark inverse. Francis's mind raced with catastrophic clarity. This Storch was not lost. It was hunting, its crew peering through binoculars, methodically plotting the coordinates of the endless American armor snaking west of the Elbe. In minutes, a radio call from that cockpit could summon a storm of steel from hidden German artillery batteries, turning the advance into a slaughterhouse of burning Shermans. He remembered the horrific reports of the Schertgen forest, of entire companies erased by precisely directed fire. There was no time to call for fighter cover, no armed patrol in sight. The safety of hundreds of men below now hinged on 2 unarmed men above, armed only with .45 caliber pistols and a desperate, unthinkable idea. The dying Reich still had teeth, and they were smiling right at him. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded Francis's mouth as the Storch's shadow slid over his cockpit. Every instinct, every ounce of pilot training screamed for protocol. Break contact, radio the threat to Division HQ, and let the swift P-51 Mustangs roaming in hunter packs deal with the problem. His hand hovered over the radio toggle, but a brutal calculus immediately overrode procedure. By the time he relayed coordinates, scrambled fighters arrived and gained altitude. The Storch would have completed its lethal survey and vanished. The armor below, dense and confident on the ribbon of road, would be neatly plotted for destruction. Time wasn't just short, it was a resource he simply did not possess. He glanced at Martin, whose wide eyes behind goggles mirrored the same horrific understanding. Their Grasshopper, officially O-59, but nicknamed the Spirit of Artesia, was a flying jeep, a slow, buzzing airframe of steel tubing and canvas. It had no gun ports, no bomb racks, no armor plating thicker than the pilot's manual. Its only defenses were its agility and the presumed insignificance of its mission. Yet hovering above them was the proof of their catastrophic significance. The weapons they had were personal, almost absurd in this context. Francis's .45 caliber M1911 automatic pistol and Martin's standard-issue Colt 32J. Against an aircraft, even a slow one, it was like bringing a knife to a long-range artillery duel. Then the memory struck him, vivid and punishing. Not a report he'd read, but a battlefield he'd flown over weeks prior. A shattered column,
Tanks twisted like discarded toys, blackened and silent, picked apart by German artillery guided from the air by a spotter just like this one. The ghosts of those crews seemed to fill the empty seat behind him. Waiting wasn't caution, it was complicity. A strange, cold clarity replaced the panic. "We're going after it," he stated, his voice flat over the intercom, leaving no room for debate. The decision, made in a heartbeat, committed them to a duel for which no manual existed. Francis firewalled the throttle, coaxing every shuddering horsepower from the little engine, and began a climbing turn to position himself behind and below the Storch's tail, a fighter pilot's approach in an aircraft that was anything but. He fumbled with his harness release, the chill April wind whipping into the cockpit as he unlatched and shoved the door open, its hinges screaming in protest. The roar of the slipstream became a physical assault. Jamming the control stick between his knees to hold the plane steady, he drew the heavy, oiled pistol from his shoulder holster, the cold weight of it alien against the leather of his flight glove. The Storch, its crew likely still oblivious to the absurd threat rising beneath them, began a slow, methodical turn over the head of the tank column. Francis leveled the wings, his world narrowing to the simple, impossible sight picture of the pistol's front blade wavering against the bulk of the enemy aircraft. He was a cavalryman drawing a saber against a tank. He took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger.
The sharp, flat crack of the .45 caliber round was swallowed instantly by the engine roar and the wind's howl. Francies saw no impact, only the surreal sight of his own pistol smoking in the vast aerial arena. Immediately, the Storch jolted as if stung, its pilot finally aware of the insane threat buzzing beneath its belly. The elegant, long-legged aircraft banked sharply, its leading-edge slats snapping out, and it began a frantic, corkscrewing climb, trying to use its legendary slow-flight agility to shake the pursuer. But Francies, his own door now a gaping maw, stayed locked on, yanking the stick from between his knees to follow. The two light planes, both built for gentle observation, were now entangled in a violent, low-altitude waltz. Bill Martin, leaning out from the rear seat with his smaller Colt, added his own fire. Tracers were a luxury for fighters. Here there was only the sporadic futile puff of smoke from their barrels and the occasional glint of a brass casing tumbling into the void below. They were fighting a duel with pop guns, where every shot required a near-impossible convergence of muscle control against the buffeting slipstream, careful aim while maneuvering, and a prayer that the bullet might find something more vital than canvas or empty sky. Francis's world narrowed to the blur of the Storch's tail, the strain of the stick in his left hand, and the heavy pistol in his right. He fired until the slide locked back on an empty chamber. Reload. The thought was a silent shout. With the Grasshopper juddering in the Storch's wake, he dropped the stick back between his knees, the plane wobbling perilously. Fumbling with numb, gloved fingers, he ejected the spent magazine, dug a fresh one from his jacket, and slammed it home, racking the slide with a motion that felt agonizingly slow. All the while, his eyes never left the German plane, which was now diving toward a patchwork of small fields and woodlines, a desperate attempt to escape at treetop level. The chase plummeted, the wind scream rising in pitch. Closing the distance once more, now almost close enough to see the faces of the German crew, Francies took careful aim, not at the aircraft as a whole, but at the point where the engine met the cockpit. He emptied the second magazine. This time, the result was instantaneous and unmistakable. A spiderweb of cracks erupted across the Storch's windshield. The engine coughed a thick plume of oily smoke, and its nose yawed violently. The frantic evasion stopped, replaced by a slow, sickening descent. The pilot, wounded or just struggling with a dying machine, was going down. The pistol duel was over. Now they were simply witnesses and pursuers of a forced landing deep inside a territory still very much held by the enemy. The wounded Storch, trailing its banner of greasy smoke, became a sinking ship seeking any port in a storm.
It fell out of the sky, not with a pilot's controlled grace, but with the jarring, heavy descent of a crippled bird, its pilot fighting dead controls and a faltering engine. Francies, his own engine throttled back, circled like a hawk as the German plane disappeared behind a screen of pine trees. The sound he dreaded, a fiery explosion, never came. Instead, a cacophony of tearing wood and metal echoed through the clearing. Following it down, Francies broke through the tree line to see the Storch resting in a ragged meadow, its landing gear ripped away, one wingtip buried in the soft earth, but its fuselage shockingly intact. The silence that followed was profound and menacing, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant, muted thunder of the front. They were now deep in the ghostly hinterlands between the collapsing German front and its heartland, a place of wandering units, fanatical holdouts, and desperate men. Every farmhouse could conceal a sniper, every woodline a machine gun nest. To land was an immense risk, but not to land was an unthinkable compromise. Francies had started this duel in the air to protect the men below. To now let the German crew disappear into the countryside to fight another day, or worse, to be rescued with their valuable intelligence, negated the entire desperate gamble. With a glance at Martin, he pushed the stick forward, committing them to the ground. Francies surveyed the field with a pilot's cold calculus, short, muddy, studded with debris. It was a terrible runway, but the Grasshopper's frail design was also its salvation. He sideslipped to lose altitude, flared the aircraft, and felt the wheels kiss the soft, uneven earth with a series of jarring thumps. The little plane bounced, slewed sideways, and came to a stop a few hundred yards from the wrecked Storch. In the sudden stillness, the reality of their situation crystallized. Francis's pistol was empty, both magazines expended in the aerial fight. Martin likely had a round or two at most. They were two unarmed Americans standing in a German field next to two aircraft that would never fly again. The only advantage they held was the momentum of their own audacity. With no time to deliberate, they dismounted and approached the Storch, not knowing if they would be met with surrender or with gunfire from its cockpit. The duel at 700 feet was over. A new, more uncertain and perilous confrontation was about to begin on the ground, where the rules were even less clear, and the consequences of their noble, impulsive victory were only beginning to unfold.
The reality on the ground was a stark, intimate shock after the vastness of the aerial duel. Approaching the crumpled Storch, Francies and Martin moved with cautious, weapons-drawn tension, expecting a last stand. Instead, they were met with a scene of human ruin. The German pilot, a young Luftwaffe lieutenant, was already scrambling from the shattered cockpit, his hands raised high in unequivocal surrender, his face pale with shock and smeared with oil. Behind him, in the observer's seat, a second man moaned in agony, pinned not by wreckage, but by a grievous wound. One of the .45 caliber bullets had found its mark, shattering the observer's foot inside his boot, which was now a sodden, crimson mess. The fight had drained from their eyes, replaced by the raw animal fear of men who expected a summary end in this isolated field. Francies, his own heart hammering against his ribs, took in the tableau. The surrendering pilot, the bleeding man, the absolute quiet of the German countryside that felt more like a held breath than peace. They were alone. Their radio's range was negligible. The front was a distant rumble. Every minute spent here multiplied the risk of a German patrol stumbling upon them. The simplest, hardest military logic dictated securing the able prisoner and leaving the wounded foe behind, a casualty of war, soon to be captured or not by his own retreating forces. But Francies saw the man, not just the enemy. The observer was perhaps in his 30s, his face contorted in pain, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. Leaving him would be a death sentence, either from blood loss or from the advancing American tanks that would view a German uniform in a field as a target. In that suspended moment, the moral calculus of the soldier overrode the tactical manual. Holstering his empty pistol, Francies signaled to Martin to cover the healthy pilot. Without a word, he climbed onto the Storch's shattered wing root, his own medical kit, a small pouch of bandages, sulfa powder, and morphine, suddenly feeling absurdly inadequate. The German observer flinched as the American loomed over him. Francies met his eyes and offered a terse, calm nod. "Ruhig," he said, one of the few German words he knew. "Quiet." Working swiftly, he cut away the leather boot, applied the white sulfa powder to the mangled flesh to stave off infection, administered a shot of precious morphine, and bound the wound tightly with a field dressing. It was not surgery, it was stabilization, a human act in an inhuman setting. The German's panicked breaths began to slow, his eyes locked on the face of the man who had shot him down and was now inexorably trying to save his life. The dynamic shifted from captor-captive to an unstable shared vulnerability. They were now 4 men in a field, bound by a shared secret and a common pressing danger. The sound of voices now carried to them from the edge of the distant tree line. The German words, sharp and guttural, cut through the damp air of the meadow like a blade. They came from the tree line, perhaps 200 yards distant, a patrol likely drawn by the sound of the crashing aircraft. Time, which had stretched and warped during the pistol duel and the tense aid, now snapped into a frantic, accelerated pace. Francies locked eyes with Martin, a silent conversation flashing between them. The Grasshopper sat in the open, a fragile escape route. They could run for it now, take the able-bodied pilot at gunpoint, and be in the air before the patrol emerged. It was the only sane tactical decision. But as Francies began to motion for a retreat, his glance fell to the wounded observer, whose eyes, glazed with morphine and pain, held a desperate understanding. Leaving him was a death sentence twice over. If the infection from his wound didn't kill him, his own countrymen, seeing the captured Storch and the American medical supplies, might execute him as a collaborator or simply abandon him to the advancing front. The humanity that had compelled Francies to render aid now confronted him with an impossible choice. To save themselves, they must condemn the man they had just saved. In a split second, Francies made his decision, a choice that defied all military logic. "We're taking them both," he barked at Martin. "Get the pilot to the plane. I'll get this one." What followed was a nightmarish feat of strength and desperation. The able German pilot, comprehending the plan, helped, driven by the primal urge to avoid capture by his own unraveling army. Francies and Martin became a makeshift medical evacuation team, hauling the wounded observer from the Storch's wrecked cockpit. Every second was a scream of tension in Francis's mind, every rustle in the distant trees a potential muzzle flash. The voices grew louder, more distinct. The Germans had found the crash site and were fanning out. Dragging the wounded man across the muddy, uneven field was an agonizingly slow process, each step an eternity. Reaching the Grasshopper presented a new problem. The tiny 2-seat aircraft now had to accommodate 4 men. It was a physical absurdity. They worked with brutal efficiency, stuffing the wounded observer into the rear observer's seat, which was never designed for a man of his size and condition. The German pilot was then forced to climb in on top of him, a tangle of limbs and uniforms. Francies squeezed himself into what little space remained in the rear, partially on the laps of the Germans, while Francies prepared to take the pilot's seat. The aircraft sat heavy on its tires, its fuselage groaning under the incredible overload. As Francies gripped the starter cable, he looked up to see the first gray-green uniforms emerge from the pine trees, rifles snapping up to shoulders. Their escape window had just slammed shut. The starter cable felt like a lifeline to salvation and a trigger for disaster. Francis yanked it hard, his entire body coiled with tension. The little engine coughed once, sputtered, and fell silent. A shout of alarm in German rang from the tree line, followed by the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. The bullet snapped overhead, a sound more felt than heard. "Primer!" Francis's mind screamed. He fumbled for the primer pump, working it frantically with his left hand while his right gripped the cable again. He offered a silent, desperate prayer to the frail machine. Behind him, the four men were a frozen tableau of terror. Martin braced, the captive pilot wide-eyed, the wounded observer groaning in pain. A second shot kicked up a divot of mud 10 yards ahead of the propeller. Francis pulled again. This time, the engine roared to life with a cloud of blue smoke, the propeller becoming a blurred disk. He didn't wait for it to warm up. He shoved the throttle forward, feeding it full power. The overloaded Grasshopper shuddered, its fuselage protesting, its tires sinking deeper into the soft earth. For a horrifying second, it refused to move, trapped by its own impossible weight and the clinging mud. Then, with a sickening lurch, it began to roll, agonizingly slow like a wounded animal trying to flee. More rifles joined the first. Francis heard the thwack of a round punching through fabric somewhere near the tail, a sound as dry as a fist hitting cardboard. He kept his head down, focused on the end of the clearing, willing speed into the straining machine. The trees at the meadow's edge rushed toward them. He pulled back on the stick, feeling the aircraft resist, then reluctantly, miraculously, break its bond with the earth. They cleared the treetops by what felt like inches, a burst of green filling the cockpit before giving way to the open, perilous sky. The sudden quiet of flight was deceptive, layered with the strained whine of the engine and the frantic beating of hearts. Francis banked sharply west, putting the meadow and the shooting behind them, his eyes scanning the wings and struts for critical damage. A few clean holes, nothing vital. The greater threat now was the aircraft's performance. It wallowed through the air, sluggish and heavy, every gust of wind a challenge. The German observer's condition was deteriorating, his moans a constant backdrop. Francis flew low, using hedgerows and terrain for cover from any further ground fire, navigating by the pillar of smoke and sound that was the advancing front. Within minutes, the landscape of war reasserted itself, columns of American tanks churning up roads, infantry advancing in dispersed lines. Spotting a relatively clear stretch of field near a command post, Francis brought the grossly overloaded Grasshopper in for one final, delicate landing. As they rolled to a stop, they were immediately surrounded by astonished GIs, weapons drawn on the German uniforms in the back. Francis, his voice hoarse with adrenaline, explained the situation. The wounded observer was gently extracted and rushed to a field aid station. As the 2 German airmen were led away into captivity, the pilot turned and gave Francis a stiff, formal nod, an acknowledgement of a battle lost, but of humanity unexpectedly preserved. The immediate fight was over. On the ground, surrounded by the safety of his own army, the full weight of what he had just accomplished and the sheer insanity of it began to settle on Francis's shoulders. He had stopped an artillery spotter with a pistol, landed behind enemy lines, and brought back prisoners from the grasp of a German patrol. The paperwork for a medal would be the easy part. Believing it himself would be harder. In the chaotic, triumphant sprawl of the war's final weeks, Francis's incredible story was but a single, extraordinary footnote. He filed his after-action report with meticulous detail, and his commanding officers, astounded by the sheer audacity of the pistol duel and the successful retrieval of prisoners from behind enemy lines, promptly recommended him for the Distinguished Flying Cross. The paperwork began its journey through the bureaucratic channels of the rapidly advancing U.S. 9th Air Force. Yet, as Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the machinery of war shifted from urgent prosecution to hasty demobilization. Mountains of administrative records were lost in transit or buried in the sheer volume of end-of-war processing. Francis's citation vanished into this void, an unresolved piece of business forgotten in the collective sigh of relief that followed victory.
He returned home to Texas, not as a decorated aerial knight, but as another quiet veteran, carrying the memory of the duel as a private, almost unbelievable story, a tale of a frantic 5 minutes over a German field that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The war moved from headlines to history books, and with it the account of a pilot who fought with a pistol and showed mercy to his enemies faded into obscurity, preserved only in a few dusty unit records and the vivid personal recollections of the men who lived it. The story remained dormant for 22 years, a ghost in the archives, until the relentless digging of famed historian Cornelius Ryan, author of The Longest Day, unearthed it during his research for his monumental work on the final European campaign, The Last Battle. Ryan, recognizing the incredible cinematic and human value of the account, tracked down Francis and verified every detail. He brought the story to public light, framing it not just as a curious dogfight, but as a profound example of courage and humanity amid the war's brutality. The article caught the attention of U.S. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson of Washington, who was moved by the injustice of the lost medal. Using his official prerogative, Senator Jackson intervened directly with the Air Force, cutting through decades of red tape to resurrect the case. In a ceremony at McChord Air Force Base in 1967 with full military honors, a middle-aged Merritt Dwayne Francies finally received his Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation formally recognized what he had always known, that on April 11, 1945, he had engaged and destroyed a German aircraft with a pistol, saving American tanks from devastation, and then risked everything to bring his wounded captives to safety. His action was enshrined as one of the last and strangest dogfights of World War II, a victory finally found, proving that some acts of valor refuse to be forgotten, and that true honor lies as much in the refusal to leave a wounded enemy behind as in the courage to attack against all odds.